So I moved to Stonington in right at the end of 1975. And I had a number of different part-time jobs, basically to make a living. So one of them was with a woman whose husband had passed away, and she needed somebody to help her go through piles of his watercolors. He had been quite a well-known person who did illustrations for magazines, not unlike sort of in the Norman Rockwell, not Rockwell, I don't mean Norman Rockwell. Who am I thinking of? Rockwell, no, Norman Rockwell. That sounds good. No. Anyway, in that kind of vein. And so I would go once or twice a week, and we would sort through her watercolors, piles of watercolors, and we had museum quality, save for personal reasons, and throw away. While I was there, I was eating lunch, and I happened to pick up a book out of their library, and it was a book about wood engravings from all over the world, and I don't think I'd ever seen a wood engraving before. And I was just struck by the medium and was instantly drawn to it. And by the time I finished working for her and going through all of his art supplies also, we actually uncovered about two beautiful, beautiful English boxwood blocks, which were the prime and major thing that wood engraving was done on. And so that's how I started. So from there, where do we go?
Well, didn't you go to England did you receive a grant to go to England or something like that early on?
Let's see. I'm trying to remember. I'm trying to remember when I did that. Actually, I did, but frankly, it didn't add anything to my printmaking skills. So.
No, but I think when you talked about it, it helped spark your interest, and then you went back to study at the University of Arts in Philadelphia.
Well, yeah, I mean, I had actually been doing the wood engravings for probably 12 or 13 years, and I decided that I would go back and get a Master's of Fine Arts at the University of the Arts. Primarily because I thought that having the MFA would actually help me get teaching jobs. And interestingly, that coincided with a huge flock of people that had exactly the same idea. So I did get my Master's of Fine Arts, and I did teach for a year at the University of Maine in Orono, which actually one of my students is here, John Roman, right there. And I actually made other friends. I thought they were going to be here. Ah, there she is. Chris Sater back there. She was another one. So, and I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it a lot. And then I taught at Haystack. And, of course, I always did teaching at our high school from the beginning. But those were probably the two most, the nicest two jobs I had was Haystack and University of the Maine. And, but I also, during this time, had a picture framing business, which actually in some ways was kind of a steady bread and butter kind of thing. So that was...
Was that down in Stonington?
Yeah. Yeah, I started out in the Seamark building in Deer Isle Village, and then I actually moved it to my home studio. And I did that for, I think, probably 15 years. So how did I learn? Well, I started out really very early after my move. I was living in my house was always a fairly small house, and I wanted something that I could do in my home that didn't require a lot of materials or equipment, and that was linoleum block. So what I was going to explain is this. Now this is actually done on wood rather than linoleum, but this is what is called a wood cut. And if it was linoleum, it would be called a linoleum cut. Um, and let's see, one of the bubbles over at Acadia National Park, that is actually 4 linoleum blocks. So I cut those with these Japanese tools. So they generally have a V-shaped blade, and then a curved blade, and then a straight blade. So those are kind of the basics of that. So I did small linoleum cuts in the very beginning, and all I needed was the block, the cutting tools, which were inexpensive, and ink, and a roller, and a wooden spoon. And I could do that on my kitchen table. So that's how I first started. Then, once I discovered wood engraving, I had to have a little bit more sophisticated setup, because the wood engraving, so this is an example of what the wood engraving looks like when I've started it. So this has just been started recently. And in this case, sadly, it's not a block of beautiful English boxwood. It's a modern invention called resin grave, and it's kind of I guess you'd call this some type of an acrylic material, that little white line there. So that's a piece of this acrylic plate glued onto what looks kind of like a particle board of some sort. So the whole thing's basically synthetic. And the first thing I do is to put ink on it so that I can see my lines. And in the case of the resin grave, it makes it very easy, because you can, right away, you see your white line. So you get an idea of exactly what your print's going to look like. And these are done with...
Siri, do you mind if I pass it around?
No, go ahead. So the wood engraving is done with the engraving tools, which are, as you can see, are very, very different from this kind of thing. There's actually a range of these tools that you could have as many as 200 tools, because they all come in different widths, different points. You can pass those around too, Karen. Just be careful, they're sharp. Right, so the difference between a wood cut, which is done on the plank side of a board, and a wood engraving, is that if you are lucky enough to have a block meant for wood engraving, it actually is, if you imagine a log that was sliced into discs,
Like a carrot?
you're working on the end grain. So those, the traditional way they were made was exactly that. They would slice these boxwood trees up into discs, dry them in a drying rack in some type of a barn, and turn them over for 3 years. They kept drying these things. Then they would be cut to square, rectangular sizes, whatever. And then it was a case of sanding and polishing. So they have very smooth, beautiful surfaces. And the wood, the boxwood, what makes it good is the rings are so close together, you almost can't even see them. And that's why it's a very good, hard wood surface to work on. But sadly, really is not much English boxwood left.
So did you work with the English boxwood during your career?
Yeah. Yeah, as I say, I was lucky enough to, actually I got an English boxwood from Mrs. Sutter, who I was working for. Then I actually had a lady who contacted me one day by letter and said that her husband had had a printing business in New York City, and he had passed away and left behind many boxwood blocks. I couldn't believe it. So she said, would I like them? And I said, yes. And I can't remember, we came up with some formula that I would pay her so much per square inch, but it was just a fraction of what their worth was. So that was a stroke of luck.
So nowadays, wood engraving is mostly plastic engraving?
Yeah, yes, unfortunately. I've tried different woods over the years. I've tried maple, but there again, part of the problem with modern wood is that it's a fast-growing tree, and even maples today are much faster growing than perhaps they used to be back in the old days. Fruit wood sometimes work because it is something that grows slowly, like an apple tree or a cherry tree. So a lot of those woods just weren't satisfactory, and so I think that's why this gentleman came up with the resin grave idea. But now the problem with the resin grave is, here's one man, maybe with a helper, making resin grave blocks that are supplying probably every wood engraver in the US, which to my knowledge is, if they belong to the wood engravers network, that means there's maybe 250 wood engravers. There's probably more, but the ones who belong to that group is about 250 wood engravers. So.
Is it a dying profession?
No, actually, interestingly, there's more and more coming into it.
Good.
Yeah. So the fellow, the man who had this resin grave company, decided to retire, and so now that's the end of the resin grave blocks. So people, I'm waiting to see what they come up with next.
Well, Siri, can I just ask a question about, like if you're engraving on metal, how is it different from working on the wood block in terms of the final print?
Well, for one thing, if you're engraving on metal, what you're creating is something that's essentially more like an etching.
Yes.
And the way you print it is very different, because with etchings and metal engravings, you would be pushing the ink into the line and then putting it under pressure and lifting it out. This is a totally different thing. You're actually printing the surface and putting it under pressure. And that's how the print's made, with woodcuts and linoleum blocks and wood engravings. So,
I see.
completely different.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right, so at one point in the late 90s, I had an opportunity to illustrate a book called A Week at the Lake. And actually, there's one of them right over there, the long horizontal, right over there. Yeah, that's one of them. And that might be, well, then there's one around the corner, the little nook over there. That's another. And that came about really because a woman named Nan Mulford exhibited my work in her gallery for many, many years. And so the story is Grace and Bump, as he was known, take off on their honeymoon to Woody Pitlock Lake, which is way the heck up near Baxter. And they spend a week on the lake, and they have different things that go wrong, especially when they try to row across the lake. So it was an amusing and fun thing to illustrate. And really, I'll have to say, I probably did some of my best work, including the one where they have a terrible rainstorm, and it turns out the roof leaks, and it gets all the bedding wet, and so the print is called "Hanging the Bedding," and it shows Grace hanging it up inside the cabin. And that print, I sold that print faster than anything else I've ever done.
What was the title of the book again, Siri?
A Week at the Lake.
A Week at the Lake.
Yeah, and you can still find it if you go on Google and look up the title.
So can you tell us about your artist in residence, particularly at Acadia?
Particularly at where?
Acadia,
Oh, at Acadia.
but you were artist in residence at many places.
Yeah. So Acadia was the first one I did, and it was really a wonderful experience. They all were, but the print over there is a result of that experience. Basically, if you do, the National Park Service has a program where you can apply to do one of these artisan residencies at the national park. And what you get is housing for 2 weeks for free. And for that experience, you do a work of art within a year. And that's it. And you give a talk. So those are your only real responsibilities. Otherwise, you're just free to roam around the park, draw and do whatever, and they're great experiences.
What
So
other parks did you go to?
I think I did 6. Acadia, the Badlands, Rocky Mountain, Grand Canyon, Yellowstone I visited, not as a residency, but the last one I did was Mesa Verde. Yeah. So I did most of them really were out west. And those...
So is that where the grizzly bear print came from?
Right, so that's where the grizzly bear came from.
Somebody has asked.
I had to see a grizzly first.
Yeah. Not what we wanted to hear about.
No, the grizzlies, I had been driving around Yellowstone hoping I would see a grizzly. And finally, one morning, I was driving along, and sure enough, there was a grizzly with a cub. And she was about, I'm going to say 50 yards in the woods, but it was open, so I had a good view of her. And so I stopped. I pulled off the road. They tell you, do not get out of your car. Yeah. So I did follow that advice. I stayed in my car. And she got a little closer, but I mean, in 5 minutes, there was probably 50 to 60 cars parked there, with many people who got out of their cars so they could get a good picture. And of course, then the rangers showed up and herded everybody back into their cars. So any spotting of a grizzly is quite an event. But that was enough for me to feel that I could legitimately tackle the image of a grizzly bear. Because I will say that I like to work from life experience, actually seeing, witnessing, or personally knowing about all of these subject matters really are personal experiences. So there's a figure on stilts, kind of a mysterious thing. So that's an example of a job that I was given as part of a book. And the book was called The Tinker of Salt Cove. And that figure is the tinker who, it turns out, there's some historic truth to the story because many tradesmen came over on ships from Britain in the very early years of Maine's statehood. And this man supposedly came over and he was a tinker by trade. And he had come from a place in England that was terribly, terribly, I don't know whether swamp is the right word, bog. He came from an area that had a lot of bogs, and people actually did walk around in stilts for that reason. So when he came to the U.S., he decided he'd just go around on his stilts. And he had his, he did his tinker thing. And he had kind of an eccentric life, which you learn about in the book. And I can work typically for, I might work on that for 2 hours at a time and then take a break just because of eye strain. But I used a magnifying lens to work through. But that's probably weeks and weeks of just slow work, whittling away those little pieces of wood.
So do you sketch it first, or do you?
Yes, I do. So what I do is I make a very rough drawing of the subject matter, and then I refine it a little bit, but I never put in all the detail. It really is just the outline of the shapes. And I do it on tracing paper. And then I trace it on to the block that's been blackened, like the one that you saw, with a transfer paper called Surral, which is, I think you can buy it in fabric shops because people who sew use it. And then I spray it with fixative so it doesn't rub off. And then I start working on, what I have to decide at that point is, what is the darkest spot? What is the lightest spot? And how many gray areas am I going to have? And if you look around, you can see that some of them have much more dark. That's a good example of that. Well, I guess that one right there, the one called Spring Morning, has a lot of dark. Of course, see, the thing with wood engraving is it's, you would call it an unforgiving medium, because if you make a mistake, you've got to just either redesign or start over. I don't like to start over.
What is the process for applying color?
Oh, to do a color block?
Yeah.
It means inking each color is inked separately and printed separately. Yeah, so they're much more work, really. Yeah.
So have you done colored, oh yeah, well,
Yeah.
woodpecker.
Well, and those two back there.
Yeah, but they're lineup, right?
Well, I think one's a woodcut and one's, the Acadia is a linoleum block, and that was 4 blocks. So each one has to be carved and then inked with a separate color.
But do you do color with the wood engravings?
Let's see, I think I've only done one. Yeah, so that's a, I think that's a, no, that's a woodcut.
That's a woodcut.
So one of the differences, though, Karen, is that the woodcuts or the linoleum cuts, because they're done with these tools, they're much bolder. So you can look around and see that that's much bolder than the wood engraving. And same is true of the ones back there. And the fisher and the grizzly bear. So the cuts are bigger, just by the nature of the tools you're using. Let's see, what was I going to say? I forgot.
About the color on the wood engraving.
Oh yeah, so cutting the wood engraving. So yeah, you have to decide what's black, what's white, what's gray. The biggest challenge is what kind of texture are those areas going to have? So that's where, for example, if you look at this is the old cottonwood. There's a lot of different textures. So all of this leaf area is done with many, many fine little divots into the wood to kind of create the sense of the leaves. And then the ground is done with really a series of sort of basically parallel lines. So the black areas are areas that haven't been cut at all.
Interesting.
Siri, how do you do the gray? I understand
So-
the contrast between the black and the white, but is it because of the tools that you're using?
Right, so-
Or the big and deep?
So the gray area, what I call gray areas, or you could call them tonal areas, really take shape based on the number of, say you're talking about an area that you're going to use basically straight lines. Well, if you use a very fine tool and those are very close together, you get a certain gray. Suppose you used a bigger tool and they were closer together, it would be a lighter tone. So it has to do with the size of the tool and the lines that you're creating.